Good morning, everyone. Our group will be discussing gross domestic product. The discussants are Bajao Eloisa, Cuenco Alicia, Yamera Sara, Orindain Ronilyn, Rosero Alaisa, and yours truly, Desilio Angel Ann. The lesson's objectives are the following: define the gross domestic product, discuss the approaches in measuring the GDP, explain the statistical data.
What is GDP? Gross Domestic Product or GDP measures the value created by a country's production of goods and services, representing both income earned and total spending on final goods and services, excluding imports. GDP is all around us. It's cars, clothes, doctors, and even hairdressers. Some people produce goods like cars and clothes, others produce services like doctors and hairdressers. So if you add up the value of goods and services, you get GDP. Or you can add up incomes. If you add up the incomes in the Philippines, you get Philippine GDP. In the Philippines, the gross domestic product or GDP serves as a key metric, representing the total income generated in a year. While a higher GDP might imply economic growth, it falls short in capturing the overall well-being of the population. Vital aspects such as environmental quality, leisure time, and equitable wealth distribution are not reflected in GDP calculations. Why is GDP important? GDP is crucial because it acts like a health check for a country's economy. It helps us understand how much a country is producing, earning, and spending. This information is vital for policymakers, businesses, and investors to make decisions and assess the overall economic well-being of a nation. Who uses GDP? GDP is used by various groups to understand and assess economic health. First is the policymakers. Government use GDP data to make informed decisions on economic policies, taxation, and public spending. For example, if GDP shows a slowdown, policymakers might consider lowering interest rates to encourage spending and investment. Second are businesses. Companies want to understand the market and consumer demand. GDP helps them plan production and make decisions about expanding or contracting. For example, if GDP indicates a growing economy, a company might increase production to meet higher demand for its product. Third are the investors. Investors seek opportunities where economies are thriving. GDP trends help them identify potential areas for profitable investments. For example, if GDP in the Philippines is consistently rising, investors might choose to invest in its stock market, expecting good returns. Next are the economists. Economists study GDP to analyze economic growth, inflation, and overall economic performance. For example, economists may use GDP to assess whether an economy is in a recession or expansion, helping them understand the current state. Lastly are the international organizations. Entities like the IMF and World Bank use GDP to compare and assess the economic health of different countries. For example, if GDP of the Philippines is significantly higher than another, international organizations might tailor assistance or policies accordingly. In essence, GDP is a key tool for understanding and managing economic activities on both national and international levels. Who uses GDP? GDP is used by various groups to understand and assess economic health. First is the policymakers. Government use GDP data to make informed decisions on economic policies, taxation, and public spending. How to increase GDP? Increasing GDP involves strategies to boost economic activity. Some common approaches include investment in infrastructure, innovative and technology, government spending, promoting in entrepreneurship, trade, and monetary policy. So first up, let's talk about the power of building things like roads and bridges. Imagine a government investing in a new bridge. It not only makes transportation easier, but also creates jobs and boosts economic activity. So, infrastructure investment is like giving the economy a helpful push. Investing in education. It's like supercharging its workforce with knowledge and skills. A skilled workforce means better quality products and services, which contributes to a higher GDP. Moving on to the cool stuff. By embracing new technologies, businesses can become efficient and more competitive. Think of it like upgrading from a flip phone to a smartphone. It makes everything faster and better. Technological advancements often lead to more goods and services, boosting the economy. Government spending. When the government puts money into areas like healthcare or infrastructure, it stimulates demand. Businesses respond by producing more, creating a ripple effect of economic growth. It's like giving the economy a little jump start. Supporting small businesses and entrepreneurship is like planting seeds. Those businesses grow, creating jobs and opportunities. Imagine the government offering incentive for startups. It can lead to innovative products, more jobs, and a flourishing economy. Now let's zoom out a bit. International trade is like expanding your horizons. When a country trades with others, it opens up new markets. Exporting goods means more economic activity, more jobs, and more income. It's like turning the local business into a global success. Last but not the least, here's monetary policy. Central banks can adjust things like interest rates to influence spending and investment. It's like the conductor of an orchestra, guiding the rhythm of the economy. So in conclusion, these strategies work together like different instruments in an orchestra to create a harmonious and growing economy. Keep in mind though, it's not a one-size-fits-all. Each country needs a balanced approach for sustained and inclusive growth.
And now let's proceed to the approaches and measuring the GDP. In order to determine the GDP, there are three primary methods. These three methods should yield the same figure when correctly calculated. These three are often termed as production approach, expenditure approach, and the income approach. And now let's proceed to the production approach. The production approach is one of the three methods used to calculate the gross domestic product of a country. It calculates GDP by adding up the value of all goods and services produced in a country minus the value of intermediate goods used in production. For example, let's say a farmer grew wheat, which is then sold to a baker who used it to make bread. The value of wheat is considered an intermediate good as it is not the value of final product. The value of the bread, on the other hand, is considered a final product. The production approach would only count the value of the bread, not the wheat, in the calculation of GDP. Another example is the production of a car. The production approach would add up the value of all parts used to make a car, such as engine, tires, and seats, and subtract the value of any intermediate good used in the production process, such as the steel used to make the engine blocks.
Expenditure approach. It is also known as a spending approach, which calculates the spending of different groups that participate in the economy. The formula is gross domestic product equals consumption plus government spending plus investment plus net exports. Consumption refers to private consumption expenditures or consumer spending. On the other hand, government spending represents government expenditure and gross investment. Investment refers to private domestic investment or capital expenditures. And net exports are the country's goods and services which is exported to the other countries plus the imports that are purchased by domestic consumers. For instance, you buy a new car. The expenditure approach would add up the value of the car which is considered a final product and it include in the calculation of GDP. Same situation as the government spends money on the infrastructure projects such as building roads or bridges. The expenditure approach would add up the value of these projects and include them in the calculation of gross domestic product. In addition to that is the spending on groceries. The expenditure approach would add up all the spending on groceries by households which includes the purchase of final goods and services produced within the country.
Now let's proceed to the income approach. Income approach is another method used to calculate the gross domestic product of a country. It calculates GDP by adding up all the income earned by household, companies, and the government operating within an economy over a given period of time.
Yes, you're definitely right, Miss Eloisa. So, as an example, let us say you work at a company that produces cars. Your salary is part of the income generated by the company, which is included in the calculation of gross domestic product using the income approach. Similarly, the profits earned by the company, the rent paid by the company for its office space, and the interest earned by the company on its investments are all included in the calculation of gross domestic product using the income approach. Another example is the income earned by a farmer. The income approach would add up all the income earned by the farmer from selling crops, livestock, and other agricultural products.
So, statistical data. What is statistical data? Statistical data are the outcomes or the observation which occur in a scientific experiment and explanation. Statistical data refers to the numerical results. These data are analyzed using a statistical method to draw conclusion into underlying population and phenomenon. For example, in a clinical trial for a new medication, the statistical data would include the numbers of participants in the study, their age, gender, and other demographic information, as well as the result of the treatment, such as the number of patients who experienced side effects or the number who showed improvement in their symptoms. This data would then be analyzed using a statistical test to determine the effectiveness of the medication and the likelihood of similar results in the general population.
Hi, my name is Aliha Maria Cuenco and I will explain the types of statistical data. Statistical data have two categories, the qualitative and quantitative. The qualitative is the genders, education status, marital status, and the quantitative is the age, height, and weight. The quantitative data from the word itself, quantitative. It is a number-based, countable, or measurable. The qualitative data is the interpretation-based, descriptive, and relating to language. Quantitative data tell us how many, how much, or how often in calculations. The qualitative data can help us understand why, how, or what happened behind the certain behavior.
So we have two types of data, the primary data and the secondary data. The primary data are those which collected from the units or individuals directly, and those data have never been used for any purpose earlier. Furthermore, primary data is the original data that is collected directly from individual or units for the first time, without any prior use or manipulation. This type of data is often collected through surveys, questionnaires, experiments, or observation, and can provide valuable insight into the characteristic and behavior of the target population.
One of the two categories of data, the secondary data. Secondary data collected by some individual or agency and is statistically treated to draw certain conclusions. Secondary data means data collected by someone else earlier, like surveys, observations, experiments, questionnaire, personal interview. It from the word itself, secondary. It is basically a second-hand pieces of information. It's already collected and it is less reliable.
An example of gross domestic statistical data. This is the Q1 GDP growth slowest in 2 years. The Philippine economy grew by 6.4% in the first quarter, the slowest in 2 years as elevated inflation and rising interest rates dampened consumer spending, the statistic agency said on Thursday. Preliminary data from the Philippine Statistic Authority showed that the gross domestic product expanded by 6.4% in the January to March period, slower than the revised 7.1% growth in the previous quarter, and the 8% expansion in the first quarter of 2022. It exceeded the median's estimate of 6.1% GDP growth in the business world pool of 23 economists and settled within the government's 6 to 7% target for the year. As you can see on the lower left side, consumer spending, household final consumption, which contributes around 3/4 to GDP, grew by 6.3% in the first quarter. However, this was lower than the 7% growth in the previous quarter and 10% a year earlier. Meanwhile, government expenditure growth rose to 6.2%, faster than the 3.5% in the first quarter last year and 3.3% in the fourth quarter. Gross capital formation, the investment component of the economy, jumped 12.2% from 3.8% in the fourth quarter. However, this was lower than the 17.7% growth in the first quarter of 2022. And in the lower right side, the industry growth is to 3.9% from 10% a year ago, while agriculture expanded by 2.2% from 0.2% a year ago. Net primary income from the rest of the world was 81.2%, lower than the 102.7% in the first quarter of 2022, but better than the 59.9% in the previous quarter. Gross national income, the sum of nation's GDP and net income received from overseas, rose by 9.9%, slightly lower than the 10.5% a year ago, but higher than the 9.3% in the fourth quarter. This is the latest Philippine GDP. The Philippine economy realized a faster expansion in the third quarter, thanks to increased government spending, as the country battled a slowdown in domestic consumption due to stubborn inflation. Data from the Philippine Statistics Authority showed Thursday that the local economy grew to 5.9%, stronger than the 4.3% growth recorded in the quarter prior. This brings the year-to-date average growth to 5.5%, with more effort needed to achieve the government's 6% to 7% target. Public spending picked up by 6.7% in the July to September period. This came after the government's implemented catch-up plan, as the 7.1% contraction posted in the second quarter weighed down economic growth. Domestic consumption, however, posted a weaker growth of 5% due to higher food inflation. The Philippine economy need to accelerate by 7.2% in the fourth quarter to meet even the low end of the target. That's all. Thanks for listening.